Good morning and welcome to MEI's 75th anniversary celebration. I'm Jerry Firestein, Senior Vice President and Head of the Policy Center here at the Middle East Institute. In 1946, inspired by his experiences in the region prior to World War II, George Camp Kaiser established a center for the study of the Middle East. An architect by training and a student of Islamic architecture particularly, Kaiser brought together a group of individuals who shared his interest in the region and his conviction that of its importance in world affairs that would only increase as the century progressed. Among those who joined Kaiser at the founding were Christian Herter, who would go on to become Dwight Eisenhower's Secretary of State, Ambassador George Allen, who served as the US ambassador to Iran in the Truman administration, and Halford Hoskins, who directed what would eventually become Johns Hopkins SAIS. Kaiser and his colleagues envisioned a nonpartisan center of learning where leaders from disparate fields could converge and collaborate in order to increase knowledge of the Middle East among citizens of the United States and to promote a better understanding between the peoples of the two areas. This broad mandate was to be pursued through a quarterly journal, a library dedicated exclusively to the Middle East, courses in the languages, history, religion, culture, and politics of the region, research by and for scholars in the emerging fields of Middle East studies, and conferences and public lectures that would provide a forum for discussion. 75 years later, that remains MEI's core mission. To learn more about MEI, its history, and its vision for the future, please click the link in the Zoom chat box or visit www.mei.edu. Today, to mark the occasion of our 75th birthday, we have assembled a blue ribbon panel of experts and practitioners who can share with us their experiences and their perspectives on some of the key moments in the contemporary history of US relations with the Middle East and North Africa. First, Ed Jerigian was a career Foreign Service officer from 1962 to 1994. He served as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from 1991 to 1993, and subsequently as ambassador to Syria and to Israel. Similarly, Ann Patterson was also a career Foreign Service officer from 1973 to 2017. Over the course of her career, Ann served in Saudi Arabia and as ambassador to Pakistan from 2007 to 10, ambassador to Egypt from 2011 to 13, and as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from 2013 to 2017. Next, Hunain al-Mugheri had a long and distinguished career as a senior official in the government of the Sultanate of Oman, including service in the Ministry of Economy and Trade in Muscat and as the Omani ambassador to the United States from 2005 to 2021. And then to share a perspective from Capitol Hill, we're joined by Ed Royce, who served as a member of Congress from California from 1993 to 2019. From 2013 to 2019, Ed served as chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. To begin, I'll ask each of our panelists to speak for a few minutes on a selected topic, and we will then turn to a moderated conversation. You can ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I'll be looking at all of your questions and will factor as many as possible into the discussion. To submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, also please email events@mei.edu. With that, let's begin our conversation, and I'm going to turn to you, Ed Jerigian, first, to ask about your experiences, and particularly if you could comment for a few minutes on a critical development during your tenure as the Assistant Secretary, and that was the Madrid conference and the beginning of our effort at Middle East diplomacy to resolve the Arab-Israeli crisis. Ed?
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you all. Well, 70 years after Israel's independence and the Arab-Israeli peace process is obviously frozen. There's a very unstable status quo. You have 6 million Arabs and 6 million Jews living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Neither one are going anywhere. They're there. The issue is land. Over the years, Israeli settlement activity has increased, whereby we now have 650,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The land for peace principle, which, as you all know, is the critical principle in the United Nations resolutions and all our efforts, including, obviously, Jerry, the Madrid Peace Conference, which was based on UN resolutions 242, 338, and the principle of land for peace, has been compromised by the lack of progress on the ground in the Israeli Arab and Israeli Palestinian context. So we've all worked for the so-called two-state solution, which basically connotes an independent Palestinian state living in peace and security next to the state of Israel. That concept now is under serious question because of what I've mentioned, the issues, the developments on the ground. And we're hearing much more about a one-state solution now. And when I visited the West Bank 2 years ago, I guess now, before COVID, I was really struck by meetings with young Palestinians who were telling me, and Khalil Shikaki, the pollster, the Palestinian pollster, brings this out in his statistics, that many of these young Palestinians were telling me, we do not want another Arab autocratic state called Palestine. We want equal rights. We want one state with equal rights. That, of course, is a growing trend amongst young Palestinians, according to these polls. But the one-state solution has two aspects: either one state with equal rights or one state with unequal rights, or a so-called apartheid state. In my view, under either one of these options, as a former US ambassador to Israel, if Israel is defining itself as a democratic Jewish state, it will not remain a democratic Jewish state under either one of these options, for the obvious reasons. If you have equal rights, the Palestinian population will demographically grow in the future, and the Jewish character of the state will be in question. And if you have unequal rights, the democratic nature of an Israeli state will be under question. So those are some of the, if I could call them, existential problems that we collectively face on this issue. The concept of a democratic state is therefore, and a Jewish state would be under question. The other basic concept is Palestinian self-determination and the creation of an independent Palestinian state. So there are two of the major objectives that are in play today under stressful conditions. The Palestinians are divided amongst themselves, Hamas, Fatah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, all these factions. You've seen the up and down in the prospects for Palestinian elections. There's a weak leadership. The Israeli polity is very divided, more divided than I've ever seen amongst itself. And we're witnessing today the latest efforts to have a new prime minister elected in Israel, and under what coalitions that can be formed. Bibi Netanyahu is fighting for his political and individual life because of indictments against him. We then have the Abraham Accords under the Trump administration that were heralded as a breakthrough in the Middle East. I consider these accords as transactional arrangements, not peace treaties. I think their normalization is the word, but they're not peace treaties. I think the only hope one can have is to build on them, to use the influence of the Arab states that are part of the Abraham Accords to influence the Israelis and the Palestinians to move toward peace. But that is yet to be seen and yet to be determined. You mentioned the Madrid Peace Conference. You know, when I look at US diplomacy, we've had many failures, as we all know, on this program. But we've also had successes, and certainly the Carter-Begin, Anwar Sadat peace accords, the Israeli-Egyptian accords, were a great success. I consider the Madrid Peace Conference a great success because it broke through the barriers and for the first time got the Israelis and all of Israel's Arab neighbors around the same table to negotiate directly, something the Israelis had been asking for 40 years at the time, to negotiate directly with their Arab neighbors. We accomplished that. And we created two categories of engagement, as you will remember: the bilateral relations between Israel and Syria, and Israel and Lebanon, and Israel and Palestine, and Israel and all its immediate neighbors. But then the second track, the multilateral track, which was the regional issues, the economic issues, refugee issues, environmental issues, security issues. That is a bit akin to what the Abraham Accords are, the regional track. But I remember Secretary Baker making it very clear that the primary track was the one that would bring this all together, and that the secondary track could not achieve on its own an Israeli-Palestinian or Israeli-Arab peace treaties. I just want to remind everyone of that basic history. As to our role, we'll have to see what the Biden administration is going to develop as a peace in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian issue and its relationships with the Arab world. I will defer to my colleagues to comment on that. But with a new government in Israel, the shift to the right in Israel, the very confused situation on the Palestinian side of the political equation, and the focal point on Iran, even with the Biden administration, the focal point in the Trump administration was Iran and maximum pressure. And now the focal point of the Biden administration is reviving the JCPOA. Where does that put the Israeli-Palestinian situation? And that will be determined in the future. I'll end there, Jerry.
Thanks, Ed, and I think that's a rich topic to follow up on a little bit later on in our conversation. Let me turn next to Hunaina and speak. You know, in terms of U.S. engagement with the region, obviously the Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab tracks have been a dominant feature of our engagement, involvement in the region for many, many years, I think, as you've laid out, Ed. Hunaina, the other major feature, at least of contemporary U.S. engagement, has been the situation in the Gulf, particularly involving Iran, and the substantial role that Oman, and particularly His Majesty the Sultan, played over many years in influencing the direction, the creation of the GCC, the role that Oman played in the Iran-Iraq War, and then after that, of course, in the first Gulf War, and keeping in mind that the King Khalid military city, which the Sultan was very much involved with in its creation and its construction in the 1980s, was a critical component of our intervention in 1990-91 in the liberation of Kuwait. So if you could share with us a little bit of your perspective, of the perspective from Oman, about developments in the Gulf over those years.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. Good afternoon or good morning to all of you. I'm in Abu Dhabi, so it's afternoon for us. I'll start by talking about the Gulf Society, which has a rich history that dates back many years, hundreds of years, in fact. The Gulf Cooperation Council was established in Riyadh in 1981. And as you know, Oman was a founding member of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And this is a unity among 6 members, namely Saudi Arabia, Oman, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE. And this unity is based on their common objectives, their similar political and cultural identities. The GCC is one regional organization that is unique in that its members have the same culture, religion, tradition, and they speak the same language. There's a number of regional organizations, but not all of them have the same language, religion, and culture. While there may have been differences in opinions between member nations, they were able to reconcile and continue peaceful relations. The US has a special relationship with all the 6 Gulf countries. Some relationships go back as far as the 1930s, and with some after the discovery of the oil. Oman's relationship with the US, however, began in 1983, when Oman and the US signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce during the time when Andrew Jackson was President of the United States. The first Omani envoy arrived in the US in 1840. I'll speak a little bit about the first Gulf War, where in 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait in the hope that the Kuwait oil reserves would help pay for the massive debt that Iraq accrued in its war with Iran. In response, the US and the UN Security Council demanded that Saddam Hussein withdraw Iraq troops from Kuwait, but Saddam Hussein refused. Over the course of 6 weeks, the United States coalition of 34 nations began an intensive bombing campaign against strategic Iraqi locations, culminating with 4 days of ground campaign known as Desert Storm. At the end of the 6 weeks, Saddam Hussein signed a ceasefire agreement and withdrew from Kuwait. After the war, Iraq was required to submit to inspections to ensure it possessed no chemical or other weapons of mass destruction. Unfortunately, this led to the 2003 Second Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq. Despite the many divergences between the US and the GCC, they still remain strategic partners, primarily on economic and military ground. With regards to economic ground, the US and the GCC countries have excellent trade and investment relations. The US signed 2 free trade agreements, one with Oman and one with Bahrain, in order to support economic growth between both the countries. Unfortunately, during the previous administration, duty was imposed on steel and aluminum, disregarding the free trade agreements, which was signed between Oman and the United States and Bahrain and the United States. While the US is no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil, over half of the world's supply still comes from the region and passes through the Straits of Hormuz. With regards to military ground, each Gulf country has their own individual defense agreement with the United States and the US. They have significant military assets in the region, such as the naval presence in Bahrain and the air base in Qatar, just to name a few. I'll touch a little bit about Sultan Qaboos, the late Sultan Qaboos, and the excellent relationship he had with the United States. Unfortunately, we lost Sultan Qaboos last year, which is a great loss not only to us Omanis, but to the region. Because of the leadership of Sultan Qaboos, Oman is one of the few countries that had peaceful relations with Iran and the United States. This has been beneficial for all sides. As a result, we were able to negotiate many deals and the release of American hostages and even non-American hostages. And this is due to the relationship Sultan Qaboos had with both the United States and with Iran. His Majesty was very forward-thinking during this time, and he tried to change the negative perception of the Middle East that the media portrayed. He felt that the best way to learn about each other was through our culture. While it is unfortunate that the media portrayed us as a war-torn region, Oman tried to change that program in a time, starting off with one room at the Middle East Institute, Jerry. I don't know if you remember that. We were stationed at the Middle East Institute, then moving on into our own Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center on 16th Street in Washington, DC. The mission is to share our Omani Arab culture with the American people while promoting mutual respect and understanding between our nations. We also strive to educate a new generation of culturally sensitive and knowledgeable citizens in each society. We do this through outreach programs, scholarship, lectures, cultural partnerships. I think I've said enough, so maybe I'll let some of my other colleagues jump in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hunina. Anne, if I can turn to you next and ask the third kind of major development in U.S. relations with the region over these past years has been what's called the Arab Spring, the democratization movement in a number of countries in the Middle East, and the effort, the interest of many of particularly the young people in the region to see more open, more tolerant, more democratic societies develop in their own countries. You, of course, dealt with the implications, the aspects of the Arab Spring, excuse me, both as ambassador to Egypt and then as the assistant secretary in the 2013-2017 period. So if you wanted to say a few words about where we are, what you experienced, what you witnessed during that period of time.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jerry. And let me first say it's great to be at MEI and on the 75th anniversary, not just because of the scholarly expertise, but because of the support for art and culture and language at MEI. But let me focus on the so-called Arab Spring. It initially prompted so much optimism, but largely ended by provoking a backlash, and in some countries like Syria and Yemen, enormous suffering. And in my view, while the unrest reflected by the Arab Spring may be temporarily dormant, the underlying causes have certainly not gone away and will probably worsen with competition for water, rising temperatures, and the economic damage from COVID. This audience in particular is well aware that the countries affected by the Arab Spring were quite different. And I would say that the American response varied as well. And of course, we made some serious errors, I would say, particularly in Libya. But there were lots of similarities about the causes. Most of these governments in the private sector couldn't deliver meaningful employment for the soaring numbers of recent graduates, the famous youth bulges. The perception of corruption was an important driver throughout the region. And the perception, at least in Egypt, was actually worse than the reality. Egyptians sincerely believed that Mubarak and his family had stolen $70 billion, a huge figure which would have represented something like 25% of Egypt's GDP. And if that money were just returned to the population, every Egyptian could have afforded a better life. Another common driver was the unintended consequences of economic reforms, particularly privatization, which enables some people, or crony capitalists, as they were called in Egypt, to become ostentatiously rich, while the benefits didn't trickle down to average citizens. In some countries, police brutality and extortion, most famously the fruit seller Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia, who was harassed by local police, alienated the population. In every country, I think domestic political struggles and the balance between civilian and the military played a role. In Yemen, as you know well, as Ali Abdullah Saleh tried to hang on to power, or in Egypt, where the military wasn't too sad to show Hosni Mubarak the door because they detested his son and heir apparent. Regarding the U.S. role, I think many of the initial events in Tunisia happened so quickly that the U.S. government and everybody else was taken by surprise. These were almost entirely local movements. After some promising starts, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Iraq all experienced social breakdown, and in a couple of places, persistent civil wars. Among the big strategic winners in the Arab Spring are the Turks and the Russians and the Iranians, who were able to enter these ongoing conflicts and are now going to be hard to dislodge. I think the one lesson everyone can draw from the Arab Spring is it wasn't an accident that Tunisia is pretty much the sole survivor. It had much stronger institutions, a weak army, a labor movement that really cared about labor rights, and a population that was more literate and tolerant than elsewhere. Its Islamic leaders were also more sophisticated and had learned to make compromises. It also didn't generate a huge backlash from other Arab states, maybe because they saw it as small and insignificant. The lessons I took away from this were largely that the US needed to invest more in trade and economic activity and health and education, which I hope we'll talk about because in fairness, with all this gloom and doom, there's really been astonishing progress in the Arab world. In standards of living and health in the past 75 years. But climate change and water and COVID are the modern equivalent of these health challenges. And then we need to address what can actually be fixed. MEI had a great session a couple of weeks ago on the Al-Hol camp in Syria, which is chock full of ISIS dependents and activists. And that's a problem that could actually be effectively addressed through international cooperation. It also showed, I think, that America's military assistance programs need a serious rethink so these militaries can address their own enemies or ISIS and to improve civilian control. But again, there are not enough jobs for recent graduates. Corruption has not gone away in the Arab world. And sooner or later, these problems are going to erupt again. It may be a generational change, but the underlying issues are still there. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. And then to close out our first round, I want to turn to Ed Royce. And Ed, you and I had a quick conversation the other day, and you were noting the number of members of Congress who are traveling abroad right now. People like Senator Coons, who early on was sent out by the Biden administration to engage in discussions in the Horn of Africa. Others are traveling. Senator Murphy is out there now and has joined several of the State Department delegations with Tim Lenderking in Oman, with Brett McGurk and Derek Chalet in the region. Congress, of course, plays an important role. It doesn't often come up in the discussions that we have, not only in terms of its oversight functions to see how the administration is implementing policies, but also as a co-equal branch and as a policy driver in its own rights. And so, looking back over your experience as chairman of the committee, some of your thoughts about the role of Congress, the significance of Congress, how you see Congress playing out in its foreign policy hat these days.
Thank you, Jerry. We've heard from 3 distinguished ambassadors, 1 from Oman, 2 from the United States, about their engagement, their work. I think in terms of the way Congress engages in the Middle East, it's very important that we forge sort of a bipartisan approach where the United States speaks with one voice. I think it's important that those members of the House and Senate be on the ground because we have been caught, shall we say, by surprise so many times by developments that were not anticipated. And that perhaps if if Congress had been more aware prior to these events, we might have been able to take corrective action. I think that for Republicans and Democrats, the thought was always, to the extent that we can push the concept of coexistence in that part of the world, that there's more likelihood that the evolution that comes out of that will be one which will be one of opportunity, where women are more empowered, where, frankly, young people have more opportunity. Hernando de Soto, the great Peruvian economist, who explains how you do development through empowering and creating opportunity by liberalizing the institutions. That was our hope. What we were challenged with was, if we go back to, for example, Turkey and a secular Turkey, instead, during Erdogan's pulling of power to himself, we saw a situation where those opportunities were breaking down, where societies, instead of coming together, Kurds and moderates and Islamists, instead of being able to cooperate, tremendous dissension driven from within. And of course, 1979, with the Iranian Revolution, that caught us totally, unprepared for it. And unprepared later, even in 2008, when you did have the Green Movement, to perceive how important it was for the administration, for all of us with one voice, to try to engage, to try to rally Europe with an opportunity to reach out to what was probably the majority of Iranians in order to, bring about change. I'm still of the opinion that we've operated best when we've done it with our allies around the world. The first Gulf War and the opportunity, that was taken to bring sovereignty back to Kuwait, that was done the correct way. I think the second Gulf War, in retrospect, where the Secretary of State brought us the argument, Secretary Powell brought us the presumption that Saddam Hussein was a rational actor, that if we gave the administration the ability to say, we have the authorization of use of force, so Saddam Hussein open up to the ability for the US to go in and or the international inspectors in that case, to go in and check out this weapons program that was perceived by the administration to be there. We weren't dealing with a rational actor. And so what I'm saying is that the mistakes that we made were mistakes, I think, of not being prepared to fully understand the complexities, to understand that people would not react the way they necessarily would in the West. And part of the antidote for that, I believe, is more US engagement through soft power, through diplomacy. I think that would be my takeaway. And I think the continued engagement with young people in that part of the world, to encourage them to work within the system, to have patience, but to work with governments to try to bring about those reforms that De Soto calls for in order to create more opportunity for upward social mobility. And the exchanges, the international exchanges, are key in all of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And I think that's absolutely correct. And I know, and Ann and I had many conversations about this over the years, the significance and the assistance that congressional visitors, particularly for those of us serving overseas, how positive a role it can be to have members of Congress visit and make precisely those kinds of points and have those kinds of engagements, extremely positive for the US as well as for our friends and partners overseas. Ed, I wanted to come back to you, Ed Jerigian, and follow up. You talked a little bit about Madrid and the Abraham Accords. And of course, in some ways you could say, and taking your point about the normalization process, what we've seen with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, that in some ways it's a follow-up to the concept of Madrid, the kind of the regional approach that you talked about. One of the concerns, of course, is how does that affect the course of developments between the Israelis and the Palestinians? In other words, Madrid, the fundamental concept of Madrid was that normalizing on a regional a regional basis would empower the Israelis and Palestinians to come to an agreement. In this latest iteration, the concern has been that perhaps the normalization between Israel and the Arab world will undercut the process of resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So how do you go about making sure that the countries that have joined in the Abraham Accords with Israel continue to emphasize the importance of an Israeli-Palestinian resolution?
Jerry, I think that you're very rightfully pointing out a tension behind the Abraham Accords. Again, they're not peace treaties. Again, the focal point of any Israeli-Palestinian settlement has to be a bilateral negotiation aided by whomever, us, the international community, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That is the focal point if there's going to be any settlement. It cannot be done only through economic incentives, security incentives, cultural incentives, etc. Those are helpful. Those are very helpful, but they have a supporting role. They don't have a central role. And I think that when the Biden administration begins to focus more clearly on its Middle East policies and what stance it's going or not going to take on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, they have to think very carefully about how the Abraham Accords can be used as a positive instrument to influence the Israelis and Palestinians to move on that first track. Because on and by themselves, security for security, economic for economic is not going to work. And if I think, forget about the United States, just think within the Arab world, and I'll defer to Hussein on this, but you remember months back, Mohammed bin Salman made a statement that seemed to be very supportive of the Abraham Accords. And there was some speculation that Saudi Arabia was going to join the other GCC partners in this. And then all of a sudden, King Salman came out with a very important statement saying Saudi Arabia's position on Jerusalem is central and that any normalization with Israel will depend on an Israeli-Palestinian settlement. So there you have the tension. And in my eyes, and what we did in Madrid was establish, I think, a very realistic approach. The central negotiations have to be bilateral between Israel and Palestine. And anything else that's done should be supportive of that, but cannot substitute for it. So the Biden administration, I hope, will take a look at a lot of things. Look, MEI, the Baker Institute, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, we've all done some very good studies on this, two-state, one-state, the territorial aspects of peace, just in the NGO think tank world. You can imagine within the government, there have been similar research done. As we know, we've been there. So to Ed Royce's very astute commentary that we shouldn't be caught by surprise, the analysis and data is there. We shouldn't be surprised. The analysis and data on all these issues, including Ed on the Arab Spring, was there. I think Ann will back me up and Jerry will back me up on that. We in the Foreign Service had been analyzing and predicting the turmoil in the potential outbreak of a real crisis in the Arab world because of the social inequalities, the economic inequalities, the democratic deficiencies in the Arab world. But they were never translated effectively into policy at the upper reaches of Democratic and Republican administrations. There's no reason for the United States not to be surprised based on the content and the analysis of what its professionals have readily available. So to answer your question, let's not make that mistake that the so-called Abraham Accords can be the vehicle for peace. They can be supportive if the Emirates of the world and the Bahrains of the world and the Sudans of the world and the other Gulf countries of the world get their act together and use them as a supportive element for an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement.
Thanks, Ed. Hunena, again, looking at where the Biden administration is in terms of its perspective on the Gulf, clearly taking a very different tack from the Trump administration before it, desiring a return to the JCPOA, obviously with real implications for our partnerships with the GCC states and where we go forward. There's also, of course, this underlying drumbeat of expressions of concern about whether or not the United States is a reliable partner anymore, whether we remain committed to security and stability in the region, to sustaining the strong security relationships that we've had with the GCC states for many, many years, really going back, with the Saudis, really to the end of World War II. How do you see this playing out? Oman has almost a unique relationship role to play. You had commented on the normal relationship between Oman and Iran. How do you see this playing out over the coming years? And what would be your advice to the administration on how they should proceed? We also have a question whether you see a return to the JCPOA as a vehicle for, in fact, doing some of the things that both Ed Royce and Ed Jerigian just talked about in terms of normalization with Israel. You're on mute, Hunena.
Thank you. Iran is our neighbor. It's there to stay. It's not going anywhere. One of the main pillars of our foreign policy, Oman's foreign policy, is to maintain excellent relationship with our neighbors and to always have a dialogue. Of course, unfortunately, the JCPOA was going on very well when the previous administration decided to pull out the United States. I'm no longer in the government, but my understanding right now is things are moving with the Iranians. The Iranians are suffering right now with what is going on with COVID. I can't speak for the Iranians, but personally, as an Omani, Oman is always there ready to stand and support for whatever decision the Iranians and the United States have decided. We will definitely support whatever decision the two countries. Personally, I think we should move ahead with the JCPOA. That's the only way we were able to control or to make sure that the nuclear was being controlled. The way it was being controlled. Right now, nobody can say what is going on. I know that the Iranians and the US have been meeting, and my understanding that things are moving slowly, but things look more positive, and I hope we'll be moving that way.
Thank you. I have a question both for Anne and Ed Royce. Both of you talked about the importance of the soft power and you talked about the importance of trade, of investment in health and education. Ed, you also talked about the importance of reaching out to youth, to engaging with them. I wanted to ask you, from your various experiences, there is, of course, in the United States, within the domestic political environment right now, a pushback against some of the aspects of your globalization, a sense that trade has not benefited the American people over the years, that in fact it's often been an economic negative for the American people. There is a question about the value of investment in these international relations. And certainly we all are familiar with the strong doubts that have been expressed over the years about whether or not US foreign assistance programs have achieved a result, whether those kinds of investments in health and education have really either benefited either the recipients or the United States. And so how do you explain to the American people, I mean, keeping in mind that part of the mission of the Middle East Institute is in fact to explain these issues to the American people. How do we go about explaining these investments that you believe are important? How do we justify them and explain them to an American audience? Anne, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, Ed.
So Jerry, I think trade is unfortunately now out of fashion. But going back to Ed DeRegian's point about how our policies never quite caught up with the reality, the Bush administration in 1994 had a very ambitious free trade policy for the entire Arab region, and it foundered after it was about halfway through. And how you have to explain this to the American people, I think, is that it's vastly less costly than what we've seen now. If you can open markets, if you can employ young men, if you can promote innovation, that's all raises living standards worldwide, including in the US. And on the health and education, in Egypt, through USAID and admittedly very large foreign assistance programs, there was a massive improvement in every indicator of basically human life: maternal and child mortality, education, sanitation. USAID built essentially the whole sanitation program in Egypt. And this stuff is hugely valuable because of, again, not only for humanitarian reasons, but also because you don't have disease vectors, as we've seen recently, that can infect the whole world. And this is where I think we need to go after things like water. Look what's happening now with the Ethiopian dam, which has the chance of causing conflict between a number of countries. So I think it's hard to explain, but I also don't think we've really tried in these narrow conflict-ridden societies, where I think the cost of not doing so is vastly higher.
And also, or just our engagement is essential at this time, not just US engagement, but EU engagement, AU, the African Union's engagement. When we look at the situation with the GERD Dam, in the arrangements we've had in the past, Ambassador Patterson, even where you served in Pakistan and India, there were agreements, right, downstream in terms of at least notifying when the dams are going to be open, at least, working together in case there is a situation where you have a famine or you have a severe shortage of water, that there be a cooperative arrangement. In this particular case, the position is held as a sovereign one, that upstream there will be no cooperation with Kenya on the river there, with Somalia, with Djibouti on that river, nor with Sudan or Egypt to the south on the Nile River. So it's an absolutist position that the international community together have to go and sit down and explain, to Abiy, to the head of state, this has to be worked out the way it's worked out internationally everywhere else. In terms of your point on trade, Ambassador Patterson, what I would agree with is that it works in liberalizing the societies as long as people play by the rules. And I think what hurt the United States the most, because most places we were able to enforce a rules-based system. In Africa, under AGOA, we did, labor standards, right? Middle East, we do the same thing. We try to enforce the environmental rules. But there is one country on the planet that right now produces over half the population of the entire developed world. And that was the report this year. And that's Beijing. And in my meetings there with their premier, I asked him, there are no environmental standards. We couldn't see across the street. This is typical of our trips there in Beijing. And he said, well, you've got to understand it's growth at any cost. And our position here is just that. In other words, even on the coal plants, the ones that where they show those of us in the West where they've got scrubbers, they don't even turn on the scrubbers. Why? It's growth at any cost, and they're taking the profits in that to undermine the manufacturing process in Europe, the United States, Latin America, everywhere else around the globe, and try to bring it all to Beijing. This has to be confronted. Labor standards and environmental standards in Beijing, we have to engage on that. That was a profound error over the last 20 years. And I think that's where the two sides in this debate need to come together. But they shouldn't knock the liberating impact of opening markets, which has brought billions of people out of poverty on this planet and given opportunity to so many. There are many other reforms that need to come, but that is a fundamental part of the groundwork. And I just lay that out there as an important point. We have to engage in the Middle East on these issues, but we need to engage multilaterally and have the world see that we have to deal with these problems.
And I think that is a great point for follow-up. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to ask all four of you to comment on how do we use these cross-cutting issues. And I think, Ed, you just talked about one of the most critical ones, and that is climate change, the environment. But there are others. How do we use this experience that we've just had with the pandemic? How do we use the demographic explosion in the region that is going to stress the economies? How do we use the requirement for energy and a switch over to renewables from fossil fuels? How do we use these issues that are not country-specific challenges, but are going to challenge the entire region as well as the world? How does the United States play a role in promoting regional cooperation in addressing some of these critical challenges that are going to confront the region, not next year or the year after, but for decades to come, and to make sure that as these countries confront these challenges, they find the means to work together cooperatively to find the answers. So if I could ask each of you to comment on that, and let's go around and maybe begin with Ed again, Ed Jerigian.
I think if we draw, Jerry, on what our colleagues have said, I think what Hunain and Ann and Ed Royce have said here, first, I think a common thread of what Hunaina has said in terms of Oman's foreign policy should be adopted for the region as a whole and for the Biden administration. The key role of strategic dialogue with all neighbors. That is key, strategic dialogue. Number two, in terms of what, again, Ann and Ed Royce have said on these critical issues of COVID, climate change, and water, on top of all the socioeconomic issues that were discussed, I think we have to look at a bottom-up strategy on how these societies can be helped by the United States. And looking at our USAID programs, and looking at our overall diplomatic approach, economics, trade, environment, and energy. The only thing I would say to tie it together, Jerry, if I can try to, is I think I would hope that, just speaking as a former American diplomat, I just hope that American administrations in their approach to the Middle East adopt a Hippocratic oath: do no harm. Do no harm. 2003 was a critical mistake that really disrupted the whole Middle East and allowed Iran to extend its power into the Levant. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a strategic miscalculation. And in contrast to what we did in Desert Storm. I mean, so let's learn from the past. Let's learn from our mistakes. Let's learn from our successes and do no harm, and do it collaboratively with partners and allies.
Thanks, Ed. Hunena, your thoughts? You're on mute again, Hunena.
I personally agree with Ed. It's very important that we have a dialogue. We should all come together. Of course, those of us from the Gulf states, we have to diversify from dependency of oil. It's very, very important that we, the US doesn't need our oil anymore. The other countries do, but everybody is moving from depending on oil. So this is one of the most important things, but we should all come together. This business of everybody doing separately, it will not work. A strategic dialogue is very, very important. I think that's
great. Thank you. Anne?
So Jerry, this provides perhaps an opportunity for the US, because let's face it, our sort of bilateral policy with, let's take Libya and other places in Syria, has hardly been a runaway success. So insofar as we can promote these more regional discussions and solutions, that's probably an advantage for the US. And I agree with Hunena. The other thing that we should all look forward to now is I think it's very premature to say this, but the ultimate demise of fossil fuels is also going to have a huge impact on the region. So I think some kind of regional dialogue under the auspices of, that's the trick, is who would do it. Would you have it under the UN or some kind of coalition of countries? But I do think it provides opportunities. And again, the first place, I think, would be to discuss the dam and the water issues in Egypt and parts of Africa.
Yeah, Jerry, I agree with Ambassador Patterson. This is Secretary Patterson's observations here. I really think it's an imperative that the United States lead. Whatever, as she indicated, whatever the form it takes in terms of these coalitions, the United States has to be at the table. It has to lead. If it's the World Trade Organization, the United States needs to be setting high standards, as we spoke to earlier. If it's an issue like Ebola or COVID, the United States has to be explaining to our own citizens and around the world that we have to have an agreement where all nations feed information in as to when there's an outbreak. We have to have everyone in concurrence, just like a non-proliferation treaty, right? Everyone has to be in agreement that they're going to open things up to inspection so that we can quickly get to that source, and physicians from around the globe can work to get in there, and we can begin working on a vaccine or whatever it's going to be. But it's no longer credible to say that we can be not engaged, because these problems are coming. There will be, for example, with COVID, there are going to be new COVID subspecies here, new variants of this. And now's the time to use those arguments to bring the globe together with US leadership. Thank you, Jerry.
Great. Thank you so much. We've reached the end of our program. I want to thank our four guests, Ed Jerigian, Hunain Al-Maghari, Ann Patterson, and Ed Royce, for joining us. We have reached iftar for Hunaina, so we're going to let her go and break her fast. But I hope that you have found this informative. We've listened to four of the world's most experienced diplomats and political figures over the last hour. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for tuning in and joining us for this program. Again, we'll see you again shortly in the future, I hope.